assure you, there is a fly that will not. But for those of you who don't really care too much about the theme and just want to fall asleep or hope I pick their video, today is another requested video choice. So I would just like to give a shout out to Patrick for requesting tonight's video. Hopefully I do it justice for you. So let's get ourselves nice and comfortable. Legit always get tired when I hear myself say that while I'm editing. Grab yourselves a glass of wine, some chocolate milk, some chocolate pretzels, or maybe use this time to make a friendship bracelet. Either way, if you've had a rough week, same. We're all here just to relax. So grab whatever your vice or pastime is, and let's dive into the tale of Herbert Baumeister. Herb. So Herbert B, because that's a nightmare for my track records, was born on April 7th in 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana. And he was the oldest of 4 siblings. His parents, Dr. Herbert E. and Elizabeth, reportedly claimed that he had quite a fairly normal childhood. Nothing crazy, pretty standard, that type of thing. A sister and 2 brothers followed his birth, and as his father's medical practice progressed, as an anesthesiologist, the family eventually moved to affluent Washington Township. Lovely. Now, no matter how standard of a childhood, throughout the onset of his adolescence, he'd started acting different. Now, wait a minute. I would just like to say, Patrick, when I was researching this, halfway through, maybe even a quarter through, I was like, fairly simple story. I thought I could guess the ending. You cannot guess the ending. It is insane. Anyway, we're at the beginning, so it started acting different. He became slowly more and more antisocial as time went on. Now, this wouldn't be that odd, but it is what he did that was pretty weird. A schoolmate of his remembers him falling into quite strange patterns and thought processes. He'd often would ask his friends things like what it might be like to taste human urine. Not great, probably. One morning on his way to school, he'd picked up a dead crow that he had found on the side of the road after getting ran over. He had shoved it in his pocket and dropped it off on his teacher's desk while they weren't looking. You know, an apple wouldn't do. Here's a dead crow. He would often, going forward, play with dead animals, and people even remember him urinating on his teacher's desks. But it was actually later on in his teen years that he got a little insight as to why his brain worked the way that it did when he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and having 2 or more personality bases, which this definitely could explain for a couple weird behaviors in his youth, but he'd actually never went on to receive any further psychiatric treatments afterwards. There's no record of that. But now, I would just like to say a little disclaimer moment. Hi, Angel here giving a tidbit. Not everyone who has schizophrenia is crazy, is weird, will do things that this man will do, because you can actually have schizophrenia and have a completely normal life. Just a bit more amplified, maybe. My older sister actually has been diagnosed with bipolar and schizophrenia for as long as I can remember, and you can go on to have completely normal lives. never actually graduated. And despite this, his father was super determined, good guy actually. He really wanted to help his son and help him succeed in life. So his father was quite a respectable man in town, and he'd gotten him a job at the Indianapolis Star, which was a major newspaper. So Gary Donna, an advertising executive, recalls Herb as the overly sensitive but very eager to be somebody type. He dressed well, but despite his efforts, he just did not fit in. One time, Herb had offered to drive Gary, his senior, and his friends to a football game in kind of hopes of becoming a part of their crowd. He ended up showing up in a hearse, most likely from his father's connections at the hospital, and he had the lights flashing on it. He sped to the game, laughing the entire way, even wearing the little chapeau, whatever, the cap. And he must have just thought it was really funny, but everyone else was like, no, this is uncomfortable. This guy's a little weird. You could just give us a normal drive there. So, needless to say, he didn't stay there very long. But his father did pull more strings for him to have him work for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. He'd ended up yelling and ranting at other employees while he was there. He would send Christmas cards to his employees with him and another man dressed in drag. But despite his erratic behavior, screaming at people, they saw an eagerness in him and his intelligence, and he had ended up being a program director for the BMV, so go Herb. But you know what? Most people might think, hey, I now have this sick title. I've gotten to where I think I need to go. I'm going to start really buckling down and show him that I got what I know. He didn't do that. He did not keep that momentum up. Instead, he acted out more. He'd actually ended up urinating on a boss's desk, which he didn't get fired for. No, he got fired for urinating on a letter addressed to the governor of Indiana. We're seeing a clear trend here, right? Man loves to pee on things. So in November of 1971, Herb had actually gotten married to an Juliana Sater, or Julie. And Julie was a college graduate that was introduced to Herb from a mutual friend. They'd both actually had a lot in common. Two young Republicans eager to own their own business someday. Julie and Herb actually ended up, I keep thinking I'm saying his name wrong. So sure enough, Julie and Herb would actually end up getting married later on, and they ended up having 3 children together. So he did get let go of the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Julie, whom had then stopped working to focus on the children, had went back to being a teacher's aide in high school. Oh no, teaching as an instructor in high school. And Herb worked at a thrift shop. Now, while he was there, he'd realized that the potential that was available in a space like that was actually pretty good gig. He'd looked into a place to invest in, and Julia and himself were very excited. Again, these 2 kids just wanted to run their own business. They'd actually stables, but behind closed doors, Herb really called the shots, and Julie just went along for the ride, and not a ride that she enjoyed, may I say. Any particular matters that came up, she really did not have a choice. More than once, they would split up for brief periods of time. Their unhappiness, it would leak into their actual home. They would neglect to do yard work. The grass would grow over heavily. The home inside itself was cluttered beyond all belief. And Julie would often take the kids to Grandma's house, sometimes for weeks on end, saying to their friends that Herb had to stay because of business pressures, that type of thing. And later on, Julie admitted that she and Herb only had relations 6 times in their 25 years of being married. So, Julie, insane. And apparently, she never, and I don't know why this is important, but hey, it's everything I got. But apparently, she never once saw him naked, which for a husband and someone you're with for that long and live with, that is odd. But apparently, he'd always been very ashamed of his body. Now, it's not that weird, right? You're fighting all the time, never see him naked, never have relations. It's a little stressful on a relationship, I must say. Maybe it's whatever, though. But she was very overly trusting, which is why in 1991 she believed him in this weird alibi he had for a very odd event that if it happened to me, I'd be like, get me out of here. Their son, Eric, had been playing in the family's wooded backyard and found a half-buried, complete human skeleton. So Eric ran to show his mother, and when Julie saw the remains and confronted Herb, he said matter-of-factly that it had been one of his father doctors dissecting skeletons. He'd stored it in their garage and just decided to bury it in the backyard when he was cleaning. Simple explanation. Let's segue a little bit. Let's talk about a man named Virgil Van de Griff. Virgil was a private investigator who started a firm in Indianapolis in 1982. He conducted business part-time until he retired from the county in 89, but his firm still remained running, and he was a very respected person amongst the townspeople. He had a great reputation and was always known for getting the job done. In the Indianapolis area, the way that things go is you have to wait 24 hours to clarify that someone was missing, and the case then goes to a district detective, and if the person is not found within 30 days, it then goes to a missing persons bureau, and that's a lot of hoops to go through. So if you want to avoid this, you would go to Virgil. A woman actually had reached out to him in 1994. She was the mother of 28-year-old Alan Broussard, whom had gone missing. Most cases turned out to be runaways with little to no foul play, but he decided to help. He'd realized quickly that the man named Alan had his share of troubles. He was a heavy drinker. He was involved in a gay community that shunned him for his drinking lifestyle, and he was last seen at a gay bar called Brothers. At first, he really thought that there would be no ill intent in this case, but his opinion changed when he looked into things a little closer. He'd met with Mary Wilson first in the Indianapolis Police Detective Department, working on the disappearance of other gay men throughout the area. Weird coincidence. All with similar appearances, ages, and favorable activities. Then they came across an article in a magazine spotlighting a man named Jeff Jones, whom disappeared in 1993, just the year prior. He seemingly just disappeared, and all of the missing person shared background of social indifferences and wayward habits. But what made Virgil think that these cases were not only related, but way more than circumstantial, was the disappearance of Roger Allen Goodlett, a 34-year-old man whom left his mother's to visit a gay bar. He was never seen after that. All of the victims' family or friends who'd reach out to detectives said the same things. The victims had drank too much. will literally change color and turn a purplish blue. Yeah, not from losing oxygen from pleasure. Now, listening to this and how he went on and on about how great this was, heavily convinced Tony that this guy must have murdered his friend. He was then quite terrified and ended up doing as Brian asked of him. So Brian had asked him if he'd do that to him, and he obeyed, but was scared. He'd slipped a pool hose around his neck and watched him masturbate. This story's weird, okay? It gets even weirder. Less this, but it's a weird one. So he just choked him out while he rubbed one out. Then it was Tony's turn. Okay. So Brian tied Tony's neck. Tony had felt the blood and pressure building up in his head and pretended to be unconscious. He'd faked being knocked out and sort of went limp. He then said that Brian eased up slowly, waited a couple seconds, and then whispered his name. And then when he did not respond, he shook him violently, trying to wake him up. So I think if he was trying to kill him, we'll get there. When Tony had then opened his eyes and smiled at him, laughing, and Brian had freaked out, he was like, "You can't do that. There have been accidents before. You can die from this." To which Tony said, "Well, is that what happened to Roger? Was he one of your accidents? Who were the others?" Brian didn't really say much to this. He sort of just laughed it off. He then slurred his speech after a little bit more drinking and drifted into a sleep-like state. So Tony was wide awake and he wanted to explore the home and see if there was anything that would make this guy seem suspicious. Well, as he explored the home, things were suspicious. He didn't believe that this Brian guy was the only landscaper here, and he definitely quickly did not believe that the owners didn't live there already based on what he'd seen. There was a light amount of furniture in the place, and it appeared to be that people had lived there for quite some time. He'd went upstairs and around each room and found dressers with women and children's clothing everywhere. He then decided to go back down and try and get Brian's wallet to see what his name really was. Brian Smart, just too easy of a cover-up name. So he went back downstairs to take his wallet, went to grab it, but Brian sort of adjusted and he backed off, and then sure enough, Brian woke up. And that was his last and only chance he had to get that evidence. So Brian woke up. He'd ended up driving him back home. Yes, suspicious. Maybe. I mean, the guy lied about his name. Maybe he just likes to be choked out. I don't think that that's... We'll see. I'm just trying to not be biased, but Tony was just a fortunate man. So Brian then had told him to meet him at the club next week on a Wednesday. And Tony couldn't exactly remember where the house was or anything, if it was Westfield or Camel, both exclusive suburbs. So Tony waited anxiously for his next meeting with Brian. But sure enough, he was stood up. So the story was not really taken that well by the police from Virgil or Tony. So Virgil took Tony, his informant, to one person that he thought would really listen, the same person working on very similar cases, Mary. So Mary Wilson was in the this reading. He thought that this could mean that they were on the right track. The money his clients paid to him, however, had all ran out. They had given him what they could afford, but he still stayed on the path. I mean, he wanted to find the murderer. So Virgil had actually reached out to an investigator, Bill Hillsley, whom had been a state trooper for many years and knew his way around the highways and byways in the area. And they'd already been checking out and crossing off a lot of other places. So why not get someone who knows the area well? They checked several areas, but they came across a property marked Fox Hollow Farms and thought that he would investigate. The estate matched Tony's description. Large, rundown, a bit morbid, a bit vague in my opinion, but okay. And no one seemingly was home. So this Bill guy parked his car and peeked into the windows. He did this with several places, but this was a farm area that he really thought had matched his description. When he peeked inside, he couldn't see a pool. He really couldn't see anything, but he had a good feeling. He also was encroaching heavily on the legalities of his job, so he couldn't really go any further with that route. However, Virgil ordered aerial shots of the property, and they'd realized that it had belonged to the Baumeister, Herbert's family. Photos were showed to Tony of the aerial shots, however, of the property. He said that the driveway wasn't long enough as he'd remembered it to be. A little frustrating. So, Herb has now entered the chat. His home has been identified. They really don't think it's him, but we're going back again. So during this time, Herb's just living his life. He'd continued his surface level relationship of normalcy with his wife Julie. Savalot was doing well, but in the mid-90s now, it was visibly outward that there were strains on their marriage. Julie's expressions of her loveless, sexless marriage was weighing on her, and a bit more obvious. The neighbors had been talking about them a lot as well, because their business had started to suffer quite a bit. And by the end of 1994, Savalot had plunged. Shoppers weren't showing up, bills were high, and the stress on top of this, with the idea of divorce teetering around Julie's mind, it definitely was a rough time. But as the years went on and Julia made threats to leave him, she never acted on it. She just sat by watching the bills and the property and just bide by her time. But while she sat by and watched these things happen, she also watched her husband get very weird. At work, he'd started to be incredibly rude to his employees. His bad moods were taken out on everyone, and he would fire just about anyone who would remotely cross him. He would then disappear for a couple of hours throughout the workday and return smelling of alcohol and stumbling around. But guess what Herb decided to do after a while? He had decided to stop at the Varsity Lounge on the evening of August 29th in 1995. Tony, sure enough, saw him there. But what he was looking at was Brian Smart, the man that he was introduced to, not Herb. He chatted him up, very excited, just catching up with his old pal, and managed to even get a peek at his license before he'd left. What I found annoying about this part is you're chatting with the guy that is Brian and finding out that the house you said it wasn't was. I get it, it's hard to remember. It was dark, okay? It was dark. But like, come on, Tony, get it together. So Mary and her boss jumped on this right away, approaching Herb at his Washington Street store on November 1st, and they didn't even remotely hide their intent. They found Herb, let him know exactly why they were there and what they were investigating, and asked if they could search his home. He'd absolutely refused and said he needed a lawyer to have any future discussions with them. Mary then, and like, she's just so great, decided to approach Herb's wife after without him worsening her marriage, saying that they were tearing her life apart and upsetting the children. They couldn't achieve a search warrant, however, as the home was in Hamilton County, whom would not cooperate or communicate with them. They just really didn't care. I don't really know why. Didn't get any info on that. Hamilton was just like, whatever, he's probably good. It ended up taking 6 months for Julie actually to come forward and finally open her backyard up for investigation. So in June of 1996, Julie finally had came to her senses. Herb had become a paranoid wreck and was going off the deep end after the Children's Bureau canceled their contract with their store. Things were so bad that both Herb and Julie filed for divorce separately. So one day, she felt no loyalty at all anymore and simply decided, I'm gonna call the police. Good girl, Julie. As she spoke to them, she told them about the story in 1991 I was talking about earlier, where she had found bones in her backyard. Mary raced over to the home the next day with 2 very skeptical Hamilton County officials. Now, the officials were sure that the human remains spoken of were probably just animal bones, and even told Mary to her face that the woman's suspicions were crap. Nice guys. They'd entered the home with Julie, and her attorney was showing them the spot that she had found the remains 2 years earlier. She told them that she believed Herb in the past, but his erratic behavior and this entire investigation had definitely filled her with doubt. Fair enough. So the yard looked pretty normal, but as they picked through the dirt patches beyond the back patio, they had found a bone that was a foot long and was charred from being burnt. This is where things get wild. They had focused on the area surrounding that then and around them, and what they thought was pebbles just decoratively lining the area. Little rocks were actually fragments of bones. Julie's attorney said that watching the police picked up chip bone after chip bone was so obvious to him that it was almost unclear, knowing that they were standing in a pile of what just people thought were rocks that were clearly bones. It was just so easy to misplace for your mind to, yeah. So this was also the area that the children played in. He even said at one point that he'd leaned over and picked up what was obviously a human tooth. Like, what? Like, what? When I was reading this part, I was like, excuse me? Wait. But it just keeps going. The police, though, from Hamilton County were still skeptical. They took pictures. They didn't believe it, but Mary, Julie, and her attorney all were like, oh yeah, this is a graveyard. We're standing in a graveyard in our backyard. Yeah, that's a lot to handle. So just grinded up bone small enough to look like pebbles and then burnt bones buried just beneath the surface. Yeah. Mary had then delivered the evidence to forensic anthropologists, and they confirmed quite quickly that yes, this is human. It is recently deceased, and they've all been burned. So the police returned because it looked like the worst crime that Indiana had ever encountered, since areas of his yard were literally essentially a graveyard, and officials joined the search party to dig up the premises. An anthropological team began hunting things down, dropping orange flags where bone appeared, and in a half an hour dropped over 100 markers, making it look like a literal disaster scene. While this dig was happening, investigators went inside to see, sure enough, a pool and mannequins in the basement. There was also a video camera that was hidden inside what that they'd assumed was used to record all of the strangulations. Just like each step gets more and more she's losing it. She has these children and fears the limits of what Herb might do if this is all at their home. But they'd instantly gave her custody. Herb had tried to keep a hold of one of his sons, but to no avail. Obviously, like you have a weird graveyard in your backyard. But Herb was actually quite calm when they'd taken him from him. He didn't put up a fight. He was very relaxed. He just simply accepted it. Meanwhile, at the estate, they'd add compost piles with heavy degrees of bone. It appeared the killer had burnt the corpses under piles of leaves and garbage. Investigators interviewed Tony Harris again for his story, but their big question was, how did Julie seemingly have no clue? Well, she answered this herself. Apparently, Julie and the children would visit Herb's mother, and Herb would stay at the estate, but for quite the amount of time, several months at a time at times. And all of those months when he was alone had actually matched up to a lot of the times that the missing persons were filed. In the dig, there was a total of 60 volunteers, by the way, and they had produced 500, and they had produced 5,500 bones, teeth, and fragments, which made up about 4 bodies. After they'd searched the 18-acre property, they would learn the search was not over. Neighbors from an adjacent farm had told the police that they had found more bones next door. This led investigators to a cut-out area with a drainage ditch that separated the 2 properties. In the ditch were ribs, vertebrae, and spines, and the bones were very so gross. And the bones in this area were not burnt or ground down. They were fully intact and even stuck out of the mud visibly. Like, wow. It just goes and it goes and it goes. As they had shoveled, they dug up Miller beers, which was Herb's favorites, handcuffed bones, and in total, what they'd gathered to be 11 men, estimately, to be found. Unfortunately, only 4 of those bodies could be identified from dental records, and I will try and say their names. Roger Goodlett, Steve Hale, Richard Hamilton, and Manuel Resendez. So messed up, especially considering so many other bodies could not be identified. Now, during this time, what was Herb doing? Well, like most of his victims, he vanished. He'd completely disappeared, and no one knew where he was. No one except for his brother, actually. So his brothers were the only clue that they had had. He'd called detectives 5 days after police had found the graveyard, saying his older brother had phoned from the little Michigan town Fenville, saying he was on a business trip and needed cash fast. So his brother had sent him some money, and he became aware of what was happening at the ranch afterward, but phoned the police right away once he did. Herb did call again, asking him for more money, but his brother told him, don't run, just call the police. Don't do this, just speak to them. But at this point, he had entered Canada. Hi, ew, you're not welcome here. And he had spent several days driving east along Lake Huron shoreline to Grand Bend, Ontario. It was there at Pinery Park that he had actually shot himself in the forehead, and the note that he had left behind said that his decision was made from his failing business and irreparable marriage. With no words of the skeletons left behind him. Instead, on the 3-page suicide note, he wrote that he Sorry.